The 1960s are a decade most commonly associated with tie-dye-clad hippies, psychedelic experimentation, and rock and roll icons like the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix. But underneath the flower power, free love exterior, the 60s were a period of radical social and political change, not only in the United States but around the world. The decade was one characterized by a host of juxtapositions. Anger and fear over injustice and uneasy political conditions lived alongside notions of musical awakening and pacifist harmony. The artist and cultural icon Andy Warhol is most commonly associated with the pop art movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The 1960s in particular were fruitful and profitable for Warhol. Alongside making silkscreen paintings like Campbell's Soup Cans and Marilyn Diptych, he also made experimental films and launched the career of rock band The Velvet Underground. Warhol was also infamous for having parties and creative happenings at his so-called factory in New York City. The picture above shows him in 1966. The 1960s was the decade of the space race between the US and the Soviet Union. It began with the 1957 launch of Sputnik by the USSR and reached a climax with the 1969 moon landing by the US. Although it's well known for creating new technologies, it also created new cultural crazes like the balanced nutrition snack Space Food Sticks. Billed as something that astronauts love, it also became a snack that every school kid kept in their lunchbox. Swimming caps became more or less mandatory for those who wanted to swim in public pools during the 1960s. They came in a variety of funky designs, including flowers and seashells, and helped to keep hair dry and safe from the chemicals in pools and oceans. The problem, however, was that these Rubbermaid devices were often uncomfortable and smelly. Plus, they didn't always fit correctly. Nowadays, many swim caps are made of silicone and are a bit more comfortable to wear. The Hollywood Walk of Fame is such an iconic part of the film industry that it seems like it has been there forever. However, like many things in Hollywood, that's all an illusion. The first Hollywood star was laid down on February 9, 1960. As you can see from the picture above, the honor went to actress Joanne Woodward. She is perhaps best known for the Academy Award-winning 1957 film The Three Faces of Eve. Since that time, more than 2,700 names have been added. The notorious Alcatraz prison, also called The Rock, was closed for good on March 21, 1963. In its 30 or so years of operation, it held criminals like Al Capone, George "Machine Gun" Kelly, and Alvin "Creepy" Carvis. The fact that it was on an island surrounded by freezing water meant that it was, nearly, impossible to escape. However, plenty tried, including the unsolved escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. Eventually, due to high costs, it had to close down. Alongside talking about the vibe, one of the most common slang expressions of the 1960s was "far out." Music was far out, stories were far out, art was far out, nearly everything was far out. The overused word originally came from jazz circles and referred to particularly avant-garde kinds of jazz. However, as the counterculture got a hold of the expression, they expanded it to mean anything that was great or cool. Marcia Brady was fond of saying it, and so was the singer-songwriter John Denver. In 1963, the book The Feminine Mystique was published, and within 3 years it sold 3 million copies. This groundbreaking book, written by Betty Friedan, is widely regarded as sparking second-wave feminism. In the picture below, the actress Ava Gardner is seen holding a copy. Second-wave feminism spans from roughly the mid-1960s to the early 1980s. Building on the first wave, which secured voting rights, it dealt with issues of reproductive rights, workplace equality, sexuality, and family life, among other things. Cinema lovers had a lot to look forward to in the 1960s. Everything from Easy Rider to The West Side Story came out during the decade. One of the most beloved musicals was, of course, The Sound of Music. Released in 1965, the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical ended up winning 5 Academy Awards and was the top-grossing film of the year. The actors, such as Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer, were incredible, the story was touching and heartening, and the songs were a joy to sing. On January 23, 1960, the Trieste became the first deep-diving submersible to make it to the bottom of Marianas Trench. Inside were 2 explorers, the U.S. Navy Lieutenant Donald Wash and the Swiss oceanographer Jacques Picard, the son of the guy who designed the boat. Near the island of Guam, the 2 began their descent to Challenger Deep, a place nearly 35,800 feet below the surface. After 5 hours or so, they made it to the ocean floor and stayed for about 20 minutes. Although tie-dyeing has been around for a very long time, early examples stretch back to 5th century China and 6th century Peru. It really took off toward the end of the 1960s. Rock stars like Janis Joplin helped to popularize the psychedelic style. That being said, it went beyond the counterculture and hippies. Plenty of regular kids enjoyed the process of scrunching up a plain white t-shirt, dumping it in a crazy mix of colors, and drying it out to see how it looked. The 1960s were a huge decade for space travel. The space race between the Soviet Union and the United States was well underway. The Soviets released Sputnik in 1957, so President JFK announced an ambitious plan to put a man on the moon. That plan became a reality on July 20, 1969, when astronaut Neil Armstrong took one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. A few minutes later, astronaut Buzz Aldrin followed in his footsteps. The monumental moment was televised everywhere. The 3 days of peace and music that was Woodstock Music Festival 1969 attracted nearly 400,000 fans. During those semi-rainy days, 32 different acts took to the stage. The musicians included a who's who of the 60s rock scene: Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead, and, of course, Jimi Hendrix. A lot of other popular acts, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and the Rolling Stones, declined for one reason or another. Regardless, it was a huge and iconic music festival that has been memorialized ever since. Robert Francis Kennedy, or RFK, was the brother of President John F. Kennedy and a politician in his own right. In the early 1960s, he was United States Attorney General. In the mid-1960s, he was the senator from New York. Tragically, however, he was shot by Sirhan Sirhan while giving a speech in Los Angeles. Despite the best efforts of the doctors, RFK was pronounced dead a day after the tragic incident. His last day occurred only a few years after his brother's assassination. Both terrible events shook the nation. Most music and movies considered to be ahead of their time were poorly received during their time. This was the case with director Stanley Kubrick's sci-fi film 2001, A Space Odyssey. The expensive and epic film was first released in 1968, and a lot of critics were harsh toward it. As time went on, however, more and more people realized the genius and technical ingenuity of it. Nowadays, it's generally regarded as one of the best and most influential sci-fi films ever made. The 1960s were a tragic decade when it came to the assassination of influential leaders. In 1963, John F. Kennedy was killed. In 1965, it was Malcolm X, taken too soon. And in 1968, Martin Luther King, Jr., met his demise. The civil rights leader was shot by James Earl Ray while at a Tennessee motel on April 4, 1968. King was rushed to a nearby hospital but passed shortly thereafter. News of his passing led to anguish and race riots in multiple U.S. cities. The 1960s is well known as the decade of civil rights and social change. A big part of this was fighting against segregation in schools, businesses, and public life. For example, businesses like Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to serve African Americans. To protest that policy, a bunch of young African American students sat down at the lunch counter and refused to leave. They continued doing this for 6 months, and it launched a movement that eventually led to desegregation. From tie-dye shirts to go-go boots, the 1960s was a decade of new fashions. One of the most iconic pieces of clothing from that era is the miniskirt. Although its exact origins are unknown, most people trace it back to either Mary Quant, a British designer. Regardless of how true it is, Quant definitely played a role in popularizing miniskirts and naming them after the fashionable Mini Cooper car. The hip skirts took off and have been popular ever since. Many of the Gen X stars who came to define music in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were born in the late 1960s. For alternative rock and grunge music, 1967 was a big year because Kurt Cobain, of Nirvana, Billy Corgan, of Smashing Pumpkins, and Scott Weiland, of Stone Temple Pilots, were all born. In terms of hip-hop and R&B music, Toni Braxton, R. Kelly, Vanilla Ice, and Funkmaster Flex were all born in the late 60s as well. On February 17, 1965, comedian Joan Rivers made her first appearance on The Tonight Show. Although she had been performing at New York comedy clubs alongside Richard Pryor, George Carlin, Woody Allen, and others, this TV appearance really boosted her career. The host, Johnny Carson, became a mentor to Rivers, and the show itself allowed Rivers to develop her unique comedy style. She eventually went on to host a few of her own shows, write multiple best-selling books, and make millions of people laugh. The 1960s was a decade of scientific advancement and literary achievement. Although all Nobel Prize winners are inspiring, the 60s had some particularly memorable ones. For example, in 1962, the author John Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize in Literature. In 1962, scientist Linus Pauling won the Nobel Peace Prize, which, we imagine, went on a shelf next to his 1954 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. The 1962 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine went to James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins for their work on DNA.